Can you imagine being born without fingerprints? That was the case for a young man named Apu Sarkar. He was born without fingerprints, the number one biometric in the world, and he doesn't have them. Fortunately for him, it didn't affect the earlier part of his life. He was born in rural Bangladesh, and there was not much need for that. But as he got older and decided he wanted to travel and use communications, he found it a challenge to get his license, open a computer, travel, airport, even voting became difficult. And it'd be frustrating, right? If every time you came and it's something you were born with, and how do you change that? And no fingerprints. There's lots of things that mean we don't have access. There's things that happen over our lives that can frustrate us. Maybe you can't get to your place because some protesters are blocking something, or there's maybe a hurtful situation with maybe a parent who, kids are kind of blocking them out of their lives, or closing their doors, locking their doors, no access. Maybe it's even a racial thing that you have not been able to get into something or to do something, and that's very demeaning. There's stuff that happens to us in life that means we can't get in. That was how I expect how Moses was feeling when God said these words to him in Deuteronomy chapter 34, when he said, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when I said, I will give it to you, your descendants, I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Moses was standing on Mount Nebo in Jordan, looking out over the land of what would become the land of Israel. And he was told, after leading these people for 40 years, he was told he couldn't go in. He couldn't enter the land. And at first you think, what kind of a dirty trick is that? Like, God, why would you do that to him? That's like, the day before you graduate, you get expelled from the school and you got nothing to show for your 4 years. Or maybe the day before you get married, your spouse-to-be gets killed in an accident. Or you're about to collect a pension and you find out the company closes down and there's nothing left. Like, God, why would you do this to Moses, one of your faithful friends and servants? Why? Well, there's a story behind it, and many of you maybe know the story if you've read in the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. Moses was a leader, and he had led the people out of Egypt, where they'd been slaves for many years, and he had led them into freedom across through the Red Sea, out to Mount Sinai, and then through a wilderness, up to the edge of the Promised Land, and then was told he couldn't go in. Remember the story? I'm going to read it to you from Numbers chapter 20. It says, there's no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. To be in opposition is not a great position to be in. No one likes to be in antagonistic relationships. And here's Moses, a leader of these people, in opposition to them. There's antagonism between him and the people. And it's because there's no water, and the people are thirsty. It says in the next verse, they quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. If only we had died instead of this horrible situation of being hungry and thirsty." That's a pretty low blow, though, isn't it? Moses was the one who led them out here, and it's your fault, Moses. It goes on in verse 4, why did you bring the Lord's community into the wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why would you bring us out here? We're hungry, we're thirsty, we're hangry. Everybody got hangry? Grumpy? Imagine 1 million people hangry all at the same time, and you're leading them. It's not a fun position to be in. Verse 5 says, why did you bring us out of Egypt, to this terrible place. It has no grain, no figs, no grapevines, no pomegranates, and there's no water to drink. Well, Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meetings where they met with God, and they fell face down in desperation. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. They needed God's help. And so in desperation, they went down and fell down before the Lord and prayed. And this is what the Lord said. The Lord said to Moses, take the staff. Take the staff. And you know the staff? Remember the staff that when Moses stood by the Red Sea, and he raised up the staff over the Red Sea and it parted and the people left, and he said, take the staff. Remember the staff that when the Amalekites ambushed them, he raised it up and went up on a mountain and raised up the staff and prayed and interceded for the people. And as long as the staff was in the air, the people were winning. And when the staff, he got tired, he put the staff down. They started losing. And so he got Aaron and Hur to help him hold it up. That staff. He says, take the staff. And you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together and speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink. This is a powerful picture that God is about to provide for them. And isn't it just like God to do it in a powerful, miraculous way? So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he commanded him, just as God said. He was careful to go. I guess he was in the tent of meeting, and I guess the staff was kept in there. And so when he's in there, he takes the staff, just as, and it was noted, just as God commanded him. He was being obedient to God. And then he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? You think, where did that come from? His anger is boiling over, right? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Wait, wasn't he told to speak to the rock? He struck the rock twice with the staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. So God still brought water from the rock. But, the next verse says, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. And there it is. What did Moses do wrong? What was this sin so great that he couldn't go into the land? What happened? Well, it said, you didn't trust in me enough to honor me as holy. So there's a lack of trust, maybe a disregard for the holiness of God. And he did it in the sight of the Israelites, publicly. He did something. Well, what was it? I mean, these are rather vague terms, general terms. You know, why did God restrict him from the land? Lots of people have written about this question. In fact, I decided to check out a different source too this week. I went to a Jewish rabbi's teaching on this and read, and he pointed out that he was aware of over 100 different explanations. Anytime you get that many explanations, we don't really know, right? Why did this happen? Why was he kept from the land? What was the reason? And there's lots. Let me just highlight a few of them. Maybe it was disobedience. Because he was told to speak to the rock, and instead he struck the rock. And in fact, he struck the rock twice. Maybe it had something to do with that. Or maybe the fact that he was angry, doing this in anger, out of anger in public, as a leader. Maybe this was the last straw. There had been repeated lack of trust, and over again, and finally God said, "This is it." had enough. Or maybe the rock, some have suggested the rock was God himself, manifest as the provider for water for them. And here's like Moses, like striking it, slapping him in the face. Someone else suggested maybe it was the staff, God's holy instrument, the staff. He cracked against the rock twice. Like, why would he do that? Right? And so we're not sure. But somehow, out of anger, he acted in a way that would seem to be unlike him, the man of God. He reacted, and it cost him a lot. I was thinking this week, too, about Morgan Riley, the defenseman for Toronto who got suspended for 5 games because of a hit against Ottawa. Made lots of news in the Ottawa area, right? But it was so unlike him. I mean, he'd never been suspended before, and now he got 5 games. And why did he do it? Why would he hit somebody? Like out of this, like what was behind that? Was it just a slap shot in the net, or all kinds of theories? But the thing is, there's probably a lot of frustration going on, right? Because that's why you and me also do things sometimes that we end up regretting. Often it's because of a build-up of a number of events, a series of things, a bunch of frustrations, what's going on. And so I wonder if there's something, what's happening in Moses' brain? What's causing him to, why did he react this way? And so rather than looking at all the commentaries and reading through and all the people's opinions on this, I thought let's go to a biblical opinion on this. Let's go to Acts 7, where the Apostle Stephen, who was one of the leaders in the early church, he comments about this very thing. And he describes Moses. And it's interesting the way he talks about the story. It says in Acts chapter 7 and verse 20, "At that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child." I mean, he was quite extraordinary from the time he was born. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. But then when he was placed outside, he was put in a basket in a river because they were killing baby boys and they were trying to protect him. Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son in the riches of royalty in the palace of Pharaoh. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in speech and action. He was a respected leader. And when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people. His own people. These were the people that he was the same nationality of, the Israelites. You almost get the sense that he knew he didn't really belong amongst the Egyptians, but he had a place of privilege. He was well educated. Everything was going well, but something inside knew he didn't fit. He didn't belong. Anyway, so he's out visiting these people, and it says he saw one of them, one of the Hebrew people, being mistreated by an Egyptian. And so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. You think, well, that's maybe drastic, but he's standing up for an injustice, an abuse of power. He was standing up for the weaker. This is someone maybe God could use. But probably not, you shouldn't have killed somebody, but you see a little bit of his heart. Anyway, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. They didn't recognize it. They didn't realize it. They didn't accept him. And that rejection is a wound. Especially when you put yourself out there and take a risk, make yourself vulnerable, and then are rejected. Whoa, that hurts. Well, the next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting, and he tried to reconcile them by saying, "Hey, man, you're brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other? Settle down. You got to work this out." But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, This is the next slide. The man who pushed Moses aside said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you see the contempt? Who made you ruler and judge over us? Who do you think you are? Contempt. It's a hard thing when you're faced with contempt from another person. Contempt. There was an article in the Globe and Mail I read this week that said, you know, the worst thing you can say to another person, the most hurtful thing you can say. And so I said, oh, that sounds like an interesting article. And I grabbed on and started reading, and it talked about contempt and all the different ways we show contempt. And then it gave the line, the worst thing you can say, I wish we had never met. Don't use that one. I wish we had never met. It's the ultimate way of saying, you've been horrible in my life. And that kind of contempt, that's what Moses was facing. And the guy says back to Moses, are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And Moses realized, uh-oh, the secret's out. They know about this. It's public knowledge. When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So he ran away. I don't belong in Egypt. I don't belong with the Hebrew people, slave people, my people. I don't know if you've ever felt that kind of disconnect. Sometimes, to belong is a very powerful driving force. You want to feel like you belong. New people come out to a church, and one of the main questions is like, will I fit here? Will I belong? Will I find some of my people here? Right? It's a powerful draw. It's a powerful thing. And Moses was having trouble finding that. Sometimes kids grow up with gender issues and they feel like they don't fit anywhere. And it's horrible. They feel like they're being rejected by their family. Maybe it's skin color, and sometimes you're in the minority because of your racial background. And you just don't feel like you belong. Or maybe you're in a group of people who think differently politically than you. And you say something and you get blasted for it. And you say, I don't belong here. These are not my people. Right? We come into settings sometimes when we feel like we don't belong. And Moses is feeling that. Being abandoned. Imagine how his parents felt too when Moses fled. He didn't get to grow up in the same house. In fact, his parents were part of the slaves. And they must have been proud of Moses, but then when he left and he fled and probably never mentioned ever seeing him again. It's just hard. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of the burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. You think, why so long? 40 years? 40 years. When he saw this bush, he was amazed at the sight. And as he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and I have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. If you know the story in Exodus, there's a lot of detail after this where Moses throws a bunch of excuses at God, but God won't have any of it. And Moses goes and leads the people out. And Stephen notes in this dialogue here in Acts 7, he says, this is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge? He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. He led them out. Led them. And they rejected him. This, he goes on in the next verse, this is the Moses. This is the same guy. Right? Who told the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people. A reference to Jesus, Stephen is making here. That Jesus would come day. Jesus would also be, and Stephen, and we get towards the end of it, he's starting to bring Jesus into it, and his point is later, Jesus was also rejected, just like Moses. Jesus was rejected and sent to a cross. But get back to the Moses story. The next verse says, he was in the assembly, Moses was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him. I mean, he spoke to the angel. He heard the words of God on Mount Sinai. And with our ancestors, and he received the living words to pass on to us. This was the word of God he gave to us. He was there. He met with God. But our ancestors refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him. And in their hearts, they turned back to Egypt. This is the third time in Stephen's little dialogue here that says that he was rejected. They rejected Moses over and over again. And Stephen is revealing something about Moses' life story. That he was a man that was regularly rejected by the people he was leading. So let me summarize a little bit, making some points. First of all, there was a wound that was inflicted. There was a wound that was inflicted in Moses' life. Maybe it started as early as a baby, being abandoned, not growing up in a different home. We know that there's a lot of pain in adoption and dealing with adoption and feeling abandoned by your birth parents, and there's some difficulty, right? And perhaps he grew up feeling like he didn't fit in. He looked different. He talked different. He acted different. And even though he was like the Pharaoh's son, treated royally, he just felt like this wasn't for him. Maybe that was it. And then there was the 40 years as a. And then the next point would be the wound was ignored. He ran away after the people reject him when he tries to save them the first time, and they reject him. He runs away for 40 years and just ignores it. And sometimes we do that too, right? When we get it rejected, we just sort of bury it, forget about it, move on, run away. That's what Moses did. He says, I can't go back there. And when God comes and says, I want you to go back to them, it's like, no way. I was unaccepted, unwanted, unloved. I'm not going back to those people. And he comes up with all these excuses. But God gets his way, and he goes. But, for 40 years, it was just sort of ignored and wasn't dealt with. And it became toxic. When you repress that kind of stuff, it has a way of coming back. And then the wound is revealed, right? Stephen points this out, how over and over again it was revealed through these angry outbursts. In fact, there are 4 outbursts recorded in the Old Testament books between Exodus and Numbers, and four times where Moses reacts like over the top with anger. It's just an outburst. And I think what Stephen is doing is noticing what's going on. It's a reaction to that being rejected by the people constantly. And then finally the wound strikes back because hurt people often, right? And when people are wounded, they tend to take revenge and fight back, and it just creates even more time. 8 times it's recorded in the first 5 books of the Bible there that the people rebelled against Moses and they rejected him. And I don't know about you, but if it's 8 times you're rejected, you're probably going to walk away from that relationship. But he couldn't. He was to lead these people. In fact, in Numbers chapter 12, it tells the story that even Miriam and Aaron, that's Moses' brother and sister, they even turned their back on him at one point. Even family. That would be tough. And so maybe all of that builds up to the place where right near the end, he takes the staff and strikes the rock twice. Wasn't what he was told to do, but just out of frustration and anger, he does it. And maybe you haven't struck a rock, but maybe you've struck one of your children out of frustration, or maybe you've lashed back at somebody at work. Maybe you've just because you've been angry and frustrated at something they've done to you. Another theory, though, about this whole thing has to do with, I wonder, someone once said, I wonder if that actually was an act of compassion, that God said, you're not going to have to lead these people anymore. It's like, you've been doing it for 40 years, you brought them to the doorstep, you've done your job, Moses. And maybe out of compassion, I'm going to pull you out of that situation so you don't have to deal with this anymore. I don't know, the text doesn't really reflect that, but I wonder if there was some of that in God's thinking too. But let me just summarize now with a bit of a chart and sort of bring this home. So let me just walk through this. So Moses felt rejected. Over and over again, the text says he was rejected. It resulted in these outbursts of anger. And if you've been in that place, you know, psychology tells us that often that will lead to either depression or being driven. Anger tends to drive us to those things, where we drive and become very successful to try and prove ourselves. We're driven in some, but it also can create a lot of depression, and sometimes both. And we know from the Bell Let's Talk campaign that's going on now that there's a lot of depression. They say 1 in 3 people will experience it sometime in their life, or have people close to them experiencing it. Emotional depression that can ultimately end up in even death, suicide. It's rampant in our world. And maybe the trajectory that Moses was on is similar to some people here too. There's another way, though. Jesus, interestingly, Stephen alludes to this in his sermon, but Stephen points out that Jesus too was rejected. In fact, it says in Isaiah, another commentator on this in the Old Testament, a writer, a scriptural prophet, he says this about Jesus. He said, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of sorrow and familiar with grief, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised and held in low esteem." You know, when you despise someone, that's contempt, right? He was despised and rejected. That's what they did to Jesus. But notice Jesus' reaction. It was different than Moses's. Jesus' reaction was this. Isaiah notes that he was a man of sorrow and familiar with grief. That's rather insightful, because psychology tells us that the proper way to deal with that rejection is to work through it. Allow yourself to feel some of that pain and the sorrow and the grief, and to move through those stages that helps your healing come about. To get angry and to ignore it doesn't help. And Jesus went through that sorrow and grief and found the pathway to joy. And that's why Jesus said things like, "Blessed are those who mourn, for theirs is the kingdom of God." Blessed are those who mourn? Happy are those who mourn? People would scratch their head, how can that be? Or David said it this way, he says, "Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning." David knew all about rejection. And he knows that it doesn't last forever. There was a time when David, in 1 Samuel 30, it says David, his city and his people were attacked while they were away. The men were out, and it says that David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him, killing him, their leader. Mutiny. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters who had been taken captive. But then it notes, but David found strength in the Lord his God. It's an interesting note there, because in the midst of those closest to him who were rejecting him, he found a supernatural strength. David writes this in Psalm 16:11. You make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. You will fill me with joy in your presence. I expect that's where Moses found the relief. He found the joy. He found the friendship. In the midst of a difficult job, it said Moses, in Exodus 33, it says Moses and the Lord would speak face to face, as one speaks to a friend. This was a place where Moses liked to come, and the glory of the Lord would fill him. He'd come out of these times with his face glowing. It brought so much hope and peace and joy to his life as he spent time with God. It was the place where he found solace, where he found acceptance, where he was loved, and where he's understood. So what's the pathway to joy? What is it? For you, if I would say, what's the pathway to joy? This time of year, some of you are thinking the pathway to joy is on an Air Canada flight to Bahamas, right? It's a vacation. We love vacations. It's not just to skip the winter. Yeah, that's part of it. But part of it is, hey, this is a hard time of year for people. I just need a break. And that's the pathway to joy. And it works. But let me suggest some others. Some things that we saw today that are really important. The pathway to joy is also dealing with the hurt, not running away like Moses, but walking through it. It's about surrounding yourself with loving relationships, if you can. That was part of David's strength. He had this band of men that came around him. Jesus had his disciples. Moses, not so much. It was hard. But to surround yourself with people who loved you and accept you and care for you, it's powerful. Serving others is another one. That's what Jesus did. I talked to you about this last summer when we looked at it. We talked about Jesus getting the news that his friend and cousin John the Baptist died, and after getting some alone time, he goes out and starts serving the people. Because somehow getting your mind off of your own problems and helping other people is just a wonderful way to get, joy flowing in your life again. And then all of these people, whether it be Jesus or Paul or David or Moses, all the presence of God just brought joy into their life, especially when they were going through a difficult time. Just to be with God and feel his love for you. And that's why Jesus gave us this powerful invitation when he said to this, come to me. Matthew 11, he says this, come to me. All you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Could you use that? I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, Jesus said, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What a beautiful invitation. What a great reminder that when we feel weight and the heaviness of stuff going on in our world, in our society, when there's so many things holding us down, beating us up, rejecting us, in the midst of that, there's hope. There is one who wants to come along, who says, come into my presence, come walk with me, take my yoke. To be yoked together is to walk together. We have a prayer team after the service that comes to the front and sits up here on the platform, and just anyone that wants to come and they'll pray with you, and they'd love to pray with you and about a situation maybe that you're facing or a hardship you're dealing with, because we want to come alongside and bring Jesus into the process for you, that he's there. I want to just close with a few words from a song that's popular on the radio. It's a prayer. It says, I pray for your healing, that circumstances would change. I pray that the fear inside would flee in Jesus' name. I pray that a breakthrough would happen today. I pray miracles over your life. In Jesus' name. In Jesus' name.